Somewhere around 24,000 years ago, in a limestone cave above a river up in the far north, somebody cut the tongue out of a horse. The marks are still there. They sit on the interface of the jaw, under the second and third molars, right where you'd put a blade if you wanted the tongue, and all you had was your hands and a sharpened piece of stone. That jawbone came out of the ground in the late 1970s. It went into a box. The box went into a museum basement most of a continent away, and there it stayed for 25 years while the man who dug it up watched his career fall apart over the claim that it was exactly what it looked like. Nobody looked at it again until 2012, and the person who finally did was a doctoral student who picked that collection precisely because everybody else had given up on it. 24,000 years is about 10,000 years before anyone was supposed to be anywhere in the Americas. And the ground that kept that jaw in one piece all that time is the same ground that hands the critics their best argument, which is the part of this story nobody tells properly. The place is called Bluefish Caves, 3 small cavities in a limestone ridge in the northern Yukon, 54 kilometers southwest of the village of Old Crow, looking down on the Bluefish River. That river runs into the Porcupine, and the Porcupine runs west across the border and joins the Yukon River in Alaska. Hold on to that, because the border is a 19th century line on a map, and the ground pays it no attention. All of this was one landmass during the last ice age. Northern Yukon, interior Alaska, the drowned shelf under the Bering Sea, Beringia. It never glaciated, so while most of Canada sat under 2 kilometers of ice, this corner stayed open and cold and dry and full of animals, among them a small extinct horse called Equus lambae. The caves themselves aren't much to look at. They're cavities rather than caverns, floored with wind-blown silt that piled up through the Pleistocene and then froze. This is permafrost country. That frozen silt is the only reason there's anything left at all, and what's left is 36,000 mammal bone fragments across 35 species, one of the richest Ice Age faunal records in northern North America. It's also, as we'll get to, the reason a lot of professional archaeologists don't trust a single thing that came out of it. The excavation ran from 1977 to 1987, led by an archaeologist named Jacques Cinq-Mars, working with Vuntut Gwitchin citizens on Vuntut Gwitchin traditional land. What he found, he thought, was human. Bones broken in ways that looked deliberate. A mammoth bone core with a flake struck off it, and the flake itself, which fitted back into the scar it came from. He concluded that people had used those caves, now and then, as far back as 30,000 years. And the response from the field wasn't really an argument. It was more like a door closing. You have to understand what he was up against. In the 1980s, Clovis First wasn't a hypothesis with challengers. It was the floor of the discipline. People came down an ice-free corridor about 13,000 years ago carrying fluted stone points, and before that, nobody. So a claim of 30,000 years was more than twice the number anyone was permitted to say out loud. 2 objections did the work, and both of them were reasonable. The first was that broken bone isn't a tool just because it looks like one. Carnivores, trampling, and sediment can all fracture bone in ways that mimic human work. The second was stratigraphy. In permafrost, freezing and thawing churns the ground, and the technical word for that is cryoturbation. If the layers have been stirred, then a stone tool sitting near a dated bone tells you very little about whether the two were ever together. Neither objection was disproven. Neither one had to be. Bluefish just stopped getting cited, and by the 1990s it had mostly dropped out of the conversation about the peopling of the Americas. The bones, meanwhile, went to the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec, and sat there. Then in 2012, a doctoral candidate at the Université de Montréal named Lauriane Bourgeon went looking for a thesis project, and for her the controversy was the attraction rather than the warning. What she did next wasn't clever, it was slow. She started working through the assemblage under a microscope, fragment by fragment, including pieces smaller than 2 centimeters. Roughly 17,000 specimens from Cave 1, roughly 19,000 from Cave 2. It took 2 years. Here's what she was looking for, because you need it to follow the rest of this. A stone blade drawn across bone leaves a groove with a V-shaped cross-section. A carnivore tooth pressing into bone leaves a groove with a U-shaped cross-section. The blade is a wedge, the tooth is a cone, and the marks they leave carry the shape of whatever made them. That's the classic test, and on its own it isn't enough, which is why zoo archaeologists had by then worked out a set of 6 criteria. The shape of the incision, the internal striations, the trajectory of the cut. Bourgeon only accepted a mark as human when it satisfied all 6, and anything short of that went into a weaker category. Out of roughly 36,000 fragments, 15 bones passed. 15, about 20 more got classed as probable. Together, that's well under 1% of the assemblage, and the marks aren't random, they cluster where butchery clusters. Skinning, dismembering, filleting. Cuts on a horse mandible that line up with taking out the tongue. Cuts on a caribou pelvis running straight and parallel, the way meat comes off a bone. Now, I want to be square with you about the other number, because it matters later. Carnivore tooth marks show up on somewhere between 38 and 56% of that material. These caves were mostly a den. Wolves and lions and foxes put most of what's in them there. The human signal, if that's what it is a thin trace running through an assemblage that's overwhelmingly the work of animals. 6 of the cut-marked bones went to the radiocarbon lab at Oxford, to Thomas Higham. The youngest came back at about 12,000 years. The oldest was that horse mandible, and it came back at 19,650 radiocarbon years, which calibrates to a little over 24,000 calendar years before present. The paper went into PLOS One in January of 2017, and it made 2 claims. The first was that Bluefish Caves is the oldest known archaeological site in North America. The second was that it gives physical backing to something the geneticists had already proposed, the Beringian standstill, which says a population split off from its Asian relatives around 25,000 years ago, and then sat in Beringia, isolated, for thousands of years before moving south. If that's right, these caves aren't a stray anomaly. They're the standstill itself, on the ground, with cut marks on it. Cinq-Mars was vindicated. The dates he'd been mocked for confirmed on the cut-mark specimens themselves, using a method his generation never had. But I'm not going to let that settle into a redemption story, because what's actually going on here is more interesting than that. Clovis First is finished. Properly finished, not politely questioned. Monteverde in southern Chile is accepted, after Tom Dillahay spent the better part of 2 decades defending it. White Sands in New Mexico has produced human footprints dated to somewhere around 21 to 23,000 years, and it's survived several independent rounds of testing since, with different materials and different methods. So a 24,000-year-old site isn't absurd on its face anymore. That's the good news for Bluefish. The bad news is that acceptance doesn't transfer. White Sands is footprints, impressions of feet pressed into wet ground and then sealed over. Bluefish is 15 bones out of 36,000, in a deposit that carnivores built and frost has churned. Those aren't the same kind of evidence, and the second kind has a much harder job in front of it. And there's a problem sitting immediately to the west that I think is the strongest single argument against this site. Alaska has been searched. Hard. For decades. It's the other half of the same landmass. The same unglaciated refuge, the same cold steppe animals, and if people were living in eastern Beringia 24,000 years ago, Alaska is where you'd expect to trip over the evidence. It isn't there. The oldest firmly accepted Alaskan occupations run to roughly 14,000 years, at sites like Swan Point in the Tanana Valley. Ben Potter, an archaeologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, has spent years looking for anything older and hasn't found it. His objections to the 2017 paper were narrow ones. 15 bones is a very small number to carry a claim this large, and it isn't clear that the stone tools found in the caves were deposited at the same time as the bones that got dated. That second point is the whole game, and there's no soft way to put it. Nobody has dated a hearth at Bluefish, because there is no hearth. Nobody has dated a stone tool, because stone can't be radiocarbon dated. What's been dated is bone with marks on it. If the marks are human, the date is a human date. If they aren't, the date is just the day an animal died. In 2020, that case got made properly, at full volume, and it deserves to be laid out the way its authors made it. Catherine Krasinski and John Blong, both at Adelphi University, published a paper in Arctic Anthropology with a title that tells you the temperature, unresolved questions about site formation, provenience, and the impact of natural processes on bone at the Bluefish Caves. Their argument wasn't that Bourgeon had made anything up. It was that the 2017 reanalysis had gone around the site's history instead of through it, and that the old objections were still standing right where they'd been left. They made 3 moves. The first was the deposit itself. Frost churning moves things. Rocks fall from ceilings. Small mammals burrow. In a deposit like that, the question of what was originally lying next to what isn't a detail, it's the foundation, and they argued it has never been securely established. The second was the association problem, which is Potter's point sharpened. A handful of stone artifacts does exist, but tying them to the 24,000-year-old horizon means trusting the layers, and the layers are exactly what's in dispute. The third is the one that really bites, and I want to give it its full weight rather than skate past it. They argued that the V-shape isn't the clean test it gets presented as. Carnivore, gnawing, trampling, and rockfall are all capable, under the right conditions, of producing straight V-shaped marks with internal striations and the shoulder effect, which are the very features those 6 criteria are built on. If that's true, then the tool the whole case rests on is blunter than advertised, and in a deposit where more than a third of the bone already carries carnivore damage, you are going to get some false positives. That isn't a risk, that's arithmetic. That's a serious paper making a serious argument, and if you only take one thing away from this video, I'd rather it was that argument than the headline. Now here's why I still find the site hard to dismiss, and it comes down to how the people involved have behaved since. Nobody dug in, they went and checked. Rockfall was one of the named mechanisms. So in 2023, a pair of researchers, Litynski and Pante, ran the experiment, dropping rock on bone, then looking at what kind of marks it actually leaves. Their conclusion was that rockfall is an improbable explanation for the marks on the 24,000-year-old specimen, one mechanism tested and substantially weakened. Not the whole argument, one piece of it. And then Bourgeon did something that I think tells you more than the 2017 paper did. She went back to Cinq-Mars's mammoth bones, the core and the flake, the pieces that started all of this, and she re-examined them from a full taphonomic perspective. Her published conclusion was that carnivores and post-depositional processes were responsible for most of the mammoth bone modifications. Most of them. She took the majority of her predecessor's mammoth evidence off the table herself. 2 pieces survived it. The core and the flake, which carry no carnivore tooth marks, show fresh fracture patterns and refit together. Those 2, she argued, were more likely human than not, after rejecting a series of natural explanations one at a time. That's a researcher subtracting from her own case, in print, with nothing obliging her to do it. It doesn't prove she's right about the horse jaw. What it does tell you is what kind of process is running here, and it isn't the kind that manufactures a conclusion. So let me be exact about where this actually sits, because keeping it straight is the difference between a real mystery and a manufactured one. Settled. Clovis first is dead. Monteverde is accepted. People were in the Americas well before 20,000 years ago, and White Sands has taken every punch thrown at it. Contested but serious. Bluefish caves. Published in a major journal, argued over in the literature by named specialists on both sides, with a formal critique in 2020, a partial self-correction in 2021, and an experimental test in 2023, argued about, not dismissed, and then the cautionary tale, which belongs in the same frame. 54 kilometers away, along the Old Crow River, a caribou tibia carved into a toothed fleshing tool was found in 1966 among Pleistocene bones and dated to about 27,000 years. For a while it was the oldest artifact in the Americas. Then it got redated in the 1980s, using a better method on a better fraction of the bone, and it came back at roughly 1,300 years old. Not Ice Age, nowhere close. That happened in this exact landscape, to this exact kind of evidence, within living memory. Anyone telling you the bluefish critics are being unreasonable hasn't read that story. Where do I land? Honestly, further toward yes than I expected when I started reading, and nowhere near certain. What persuades me isn't the number. It's the pattern of the cut marks, the fact that they sit where butchery sits, on the tongue side of a jaw, running parallel along a pelvis, not scattered the way random damage scatters things. What holds me back is the deposit, because frozen ground moves, and because 15 bones is a thin thread to hang 10,000 years on. And I want to say plainly that the people who rejected this in the 1980s weren't fools. The ice-free corridor was real. The Clovis points are real. It was a reasonable model built out of the evidence that existed at the time. The failure wasn't building it. The failure was defending it long enough that a man could spend a career being right and get treated as a crank for it, and long enough that 36,000 bones could sit in a museum basement for 25 years with nobody willing to look. Nobody needed a conspiracy for that. Certainty protects itself much more quietly and much more ordinarily. So picture the ridge. 3 shallow cavities in limestone above a river that runs west into Alaska, packed with silt that froze and stayed frozen, holding the bones of horses and mammoth and caribou and the wolves that ate them. The same cold that kept a horse's jaw intact for 24,000 years is the cold that heaves and stirs the ground it's sitting in. The evidence and the doubt come out of the same fact. Frozen ground is the best archive in the world and the worst filing system, and there's no version of this argument where you get one without the other. That's what's still up there. Not an answer. A jaw with marks on it. in ground that won't hold still. Subscribe if you want more of these, and tell me in the comments which way you lean, because I've read the papers on both sides, and I'm genuinely not sure. Thanks for watching.